I'd like to take a little bit of your time to talk about our paddle and the components of the paddle, how we choose a paddle, and make sense of some of the language around paddles. I know when I was a novice paddler, I didn't know anything about paddles, and so I was making choices about paddles based on things that people were telling me. You should do this or you shouldn't do that, etc. But I couldn't make an informed choice. And so I think it's really important for an athlete to know their equipment, whether it's their running shoes or their road bike or their paddle, what have you. You know, everybody should be able to make an informed choice. So I'm going to talk about specific components of the paddle. I'll start with the top, the T-grip. And the T-grip, they come in all sorts of different materials: wood, carbon fiber. They come in different sizes and shapes. So you can see that this T-grip has a pretty nice rounded top and has this kind of semi-crescent moon shape. You can see with this Kealoha paddle that they also have the crescent moon shape, but the top is fairly flat and it's a little bit bigger hands. And you can see with this Zavril paddle that it has a really rounded, larger T-grip, which can be a little bit more difficult to navigate if you have smaller hands. So it's really important to find a T-grip that feels good in your hand, that doesn't cause blistering, that doesn't make you feel like you're over gripping on the top, and that your hand is resting comfortably. The next thing to consider is the shaft of the paddle. And the shaft of the paddle in a couple of different instances. One, what's the material made of? Most outrigger paddles are hybrid paddles, which means that it has a carbon fiber blade and a wooden shaft. We do have full carbon, and full carbon is great if you have a high turnover rate, or you're kind of just popping for a short sprint. They're not real flexible, and typically, I know with the Zavril, the shaft is a little big for the hand. And so for women, you might want a paddle shaft that's a little bit smaller than, let's say, this shaft, just so it's comfortable in the hand. The next thing to consider with the shaft is it a single bend paddle? So it just bends down here at the bottom at the blade, or it is a double bend paddle. So slight curvature at the top, bend at the blade. Everybody has their own personal preference, but you need to know why you might choose one over the other. And so the single bend, which occurred first in the evolution of outrigger paddles, it's super simple, right? It gives you a pretty nice attachment point, but it can put the wrist in a not, this lower hand into a not very neutral position. The double bend, right? It puts the wrist in a more neutral position, and so it can be more comfortable to the paddler over a longer race. You know, when I was thinking about going from a single bend to a double bend, and this has only happened in the last, 4 years of my paddling journey, I had a long talk with a paddler that had been paddling for decades about paddles. You know, what should I choose? What should I do? And he said to me, he goes, one, you should make sure the paddle feels comfortable, and two, you should try, if you can afford it, to have more than one style of paddle. It's good for the muscles. It's good to use the muscles in different ways, to apply stress and pressure in different ways. And I listened to that, and it really resonated with me, especially someone who has their education in biomechanics. I was like, oh yeah, I don't know why that's so hard to figure out, Kim. So I have both single and double bend paddles. I prefer the double, but I also will pull out my single bend on occasion, especially when I'm in the OC6. That's where I like to pull out my single bend instead of my double bend. The next part to think about is the blade itself. And so blades come in a variety of sizes in terms of the width of the blade and the length of the blade. And the different manufacturers will refer to the blade size in a lot of different ways. Like Quick Blade, for instance, it says 111 here. That means there's 111 square inches of blade face on this particular paddle. If you look at, and just as a point of reference, this blade is just a little over 9 inches across at its widest point. If you look at some of the Tahitian blades, they will talk about blade width and blade height. And so when we look at Viper or even Hippo Sticks Tahitian blade, they're about 9.5 inches across and 19 inches in height. And so there's more paddle face to capture the water. Some other things to think about is you can see, I don't know if you can see this on the Quick Blade, but it has this kind of scooped out dihedral shape on the blade surface, the water surface, and that helps with the catch. It's called the V-drive. If I look at this particular Kealoha paddle, it has a flat surface, and so they're going to interface with the water in different ways. And so again, this comes down to personal preference on your catch. A couple of years ago for my birthday, I fell in love with a particular Hawaiian paddle that lots of people were using, and I will note that the lots of people were almost all men. And I thought, oh, I'm going to gift that to myself for my birthday. And it was really lightweight. It felt good in my hand. I was really excited for this blade. And I wasn't really smart because the blade was a little bit wider, about 1/4 of an inch wider. And I have been paddling Quick Blades 110 and 111 for a really long time. I also have thoracic mobility issues, right? And so what happened to me with that blade is that it was just wide enough, more wide than my other blades, that I kept hitting the side of my canoe. And I wasn't able, if I tried to go in straight, I was hitting the side of my canoe because I couldn't get out wide enough. So to accommodate for that, I was like not having my hands stacked, which means I was cavitating. So I wasn't grabbing all the water I could with my blade. Or I was doing this, which was, doing that little side lean, which was very hard on the body. And when you're on the right side, it is going to, if I'm on the right side and I'm leaning like this and I'm pressing down my hip on the left side to keep myself from hooling. And so it was a bad paddle choice, but I learned a really valuable lesson and I was able to sell the paddle, so it all worked out well. So these are just some things to consider if you're in the market to buy a paddle, or if you question whether or not you want another paddle, but you don't really feel like you have the information to make a really educated, informed choice. The other thing I might add is you might want to connect with paddlers that have different paddles. Like for me, everybody knows I love Quick Blade, and I know Denise has some of the bigger Tahitian paddles, and Chris has some really nice paddles. I mean, we all have a cadre of paddles. I think Jill Komodo has enough paddles that she could build a small, tiny house with her paddles. So it might be worthwhile to ask people if you can borrow the paddle. The final thing I will talk about is how tall, how long should your paddle be? And historically, what we've looked at with choosing a paddle is you sit on the ground and you reach up and your hand, actually by your hip, and your hand should go over the top of the paddle. When I first started out, so this is a 48.5. When I started out as a paddler, I think I was told that I needed a 50. And that's what I went with because I didn't know any better. I think I've shrunk a little bit in the last 11 or 12 years. But what that 50 did for me, thankfully, it was a really small blade. It was a Kealoha Haleakala, which is an entry-level paddle that we lovingly refer to as the spoon. And what that did for me is that when I was engaging with the water, my shoulder position was higher. So I was trying to like engage that top arm with my shoulder much higher than here. And so having that higher shoulder position puts a lot of stress on the shoulders and can lead to injury. So you might want to think about going with a little bit shorter blade. I know that with paddling, there has been an evolution for paddlers to go with a shorter than historically traditional length paddle. I believe it might have started with stand-up paddle boarding about 10 years ago. I remember Connor Baxter decided that he needed a shorter paddle, and he was actually paddling like this in some instances instead of like that with his paddle board paddle. And then he started going to a shorter paddle, and I think everything followed. Now, I could be wrong with the history. It could have been long conversations over beers in the canoe alley in Hawaii or Tahiti to talk about the differences in paddle lengths. But there has been this process of people going with a shorter paddle. It's better for the shoulders, and it actually helps you engage the water a little bit more quickly. So that was probably more than I needed to say about paddles, but there it is. And if you have questions about paddles, I think you should have a really good conversation with Experienced Paddles. Kealoha's website has really good information and a nice sizing chart to help people have a starting place on choosing the length of paddle they want. I think Quick Blade might also have that, but I don't recall, but I do know Kealoha does. So hope this helps. Have a great day.